we're going to go ahead and get started. Feel free to keep grabbing food as you come in, but I want to make sure we have lots of time to hear from our guests and have a good discussion. And before the introduction, I just have one quick announcement. This is the last week of our electricity access month, and next week we're going to be starting our month on agriculture and waste. And we're kicking this off with Kevin Kung, who is a PhD student here, and also the president of the MIT Waste Alliance. Due to scheduling conflicts, next week we're going to be starting at 5:30, not 6. So if you're used to coming at 6, please make a note. We're starting at 5:30. I think that's it for announcements. So, without further ado, I'm very happy to have our visitors here. We have groups of folks from the World Bank, University of Michigan, as well as Development Seed. They are working on a new initiative at the World Bank, Innovation Labs, to take 20 years of satellite imagery and try to create a better database to look at electricity access and reliability. And they'll tell you a lot more about that in their presentation. So here tonight we have Brian Min, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Michigan. Kwawu Gaba, who is the lead energy specialist and global lead of the Power Systems Solutions Group at the World Bank. Anam Thacker, who's a developer with Development Seed. And then Bruno Sanchez-Andrade Nuno, how was that?
Perfect.
Who's a data scientist at the World Bank Innovation Labs. And thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you for coming.
I'm Kwawu. It has been quite difficult to monitor electrification. We spend, the World Bank and other financial institutions spend about several billion of dollars on this initiative because we have the objective of closing the electricity access gap by 2030 in collaboration with others. What happens most of the time is that the infrastructure is built, connections are made, but we are not too sure if electricity is actually reaching the people, the electricity, or the people that are supposed to have access to electricity. So we came up with this idea of using satellite imagery to complement the traditional method that we have to monitor programs like surveys and so on. And today, I think Brian is going to talk to you about the experiment we did in Senegal and Vietnam and how we took the findings and tried to tackle the same problem in India. So I'm done. Thank you. Have questions?
Thank you, Kwawu. So I am going to spend most of my time talking about this work that I've been doing with the World Bank, but I want to start with a little bit of background. There's been a lot of recent attention to the problem of energy poverty. Now, energy poverty, when you say it that way, seems to focus attention on the lack of economic resources. I prefer to think of the problem as energy scarcity, which emphasizes a mismatch between supply and demand. When you've got energy scarcity, you require choices and strategies about how to allocate those scarce resources. So in my book that's just come out, I show that the distribution of electricity is exquisitely political, and I use high-resolution satellite imagery across the developing world to show how electrical power is used as a tool to win electoral support in democracies, especially in rural and poor regions. The underlying premise is that most electricity in the developing world is centralized in its distribution at places like this. This is the headquarters of the Uttar Pradesh Power Corporation, which is a state-run utility that manages all of the electricity distribution in Uttar Pradesh, India's largest state. UP has a baseline estimated demand of some 7.5 to 9 gigawatts of power when I was doing my field work about 5 years ago. And compared to that baseline demand, the state is only capable of providing about 6 gigawatts of power at a time. That means that massive load shedding is a regular occurrence that affects tens of millions of people every single moment of every single day throughout the calendar year. Given that electricity is scarce, given that electricity is centralized in its control and distribution by political actors, it's then not a surprise that the distribution of electricity follows political incentives. And I want to share just one story that demonstrates this and also shows how we can use satellite imagery to track changes over time. Naresh Agarwal was a minor member of the Legislative Assembly in the State Assembly of Uttar Pradesh. He was minor, not very well known at the time, except in 1997 he defected from the Congress Party, brought 14 other legislators with him, and through their support to the BJP party leader Kalyan Singh, who's seated there on the right. In return, or at least as a result of that defection, the BJP was able to gain control over the state government, and in return, Naresh Agarwal was appointed Energy Minister of the state of UP. I want you to look at his constituency of Hardoi, which is this constituency here in a period of years. In 1997 is when he's appointed Energy Minister, and in the years that follow, the lights expand across his constituency, encompassing almost all of the rural areas of the constituency until the end of 2001, when he is sacked for political disloyalty, removed from his post. And if you look at the image, Hardoi is knocked back to the Dark Ages, almost as dark as it was prior to his appointment. So the nighttime imagery seem to capture stories, or seem to capture trends that are happening on the ground in terms of choices and strategies of political actors about its distribution of electricity. This insight has then led us to try to investigate more deeply how reliably do the satellite imagery actually track access to electricity in rural areas. It's one thing to make kind of broad statements like this. What actually is happening at these little individual pixel level points? So the key question then is, what exactly are we looking at here when we see light at night in a rural area? Most of the early research on nighttime lights was done in the context of the United States and Western Europe in industrialized settings, where it's not that difficult to make the assumption that light output on the ground is produced from electrical power and reflects usage of light for outdoor, usage of electricity for outdoor lighting. Does that hold in the developing world, where most of the world's energy access problems lie? This was then the objective of the partnership that we began with the World Bank. About 5 years ago, we worked together to try to develop a strategy or to examine the properties of nighttime light output in rural settings in the developing world. In this village in Senegal and 200 others, we sent teams to visit these communities, to work with village leaders, to count the number of streetlights in each community, to record the number of electrified households and the number of electrified public buildings in every community, to generate for the first time a reliable estimate of the intensity of electricity use in rural communities in Africa. We then correlated this data with light output data collected for those same constituencies. That was an effort that could not have happened if we did not have the support and partnership of ASER, the Senegalese Agency for Rural Electrification. And in fact, they were very interested in what we were attempting to do and very interested in supporting us in our project, because what our partners at ASER told us is that this question of where is electricity going in our country is one that we even have difficulty answering. We don't know when the power's not working in a remote community unless somebody calls in to tell us. We don't actually know the extent to which work remains incomplete in many of the remote parts of our country. And we don't, and so if your results can actually help us see where our grid is reaching, this would be a benefit to us. And in fact, this is a message we've been hearing repeatedly from the utilities across the developing world. This basic question of who has access to electricity and who does not is one that's very difficult to answer or to pinpoint its geographic distribution. This gives you a sense of how we conducted this study. Those green dots are electrified communities that we visited and conducted surveys in. And ASER also provided us administrative data on 800 unelectrified villages that it had not yet successfully electrified. That allowed us then to construct a large data set to be on these 1,000 or so villages that allowed us to see whether concentration of electricity use in villages was correlated with light output. Let me be a little more specific about the kind of thing we're talking about. For a sample of villages, we were able to gain even more detailed data. For the village of Rao, as you're seeing here on this map, we had access to the electrification plan for that village. And in that plan, every single red dot you see identified there is a street light, a planned street light location. By comparing satellite images in the before and after time period following the electrification of Rao, we see Rao not lit and then lit afterwards. And so there were enough pieces of data like this that provided support for the general sense, for our general conclusion, that electrified villages are brighter than unelectrified villages. Across our data, we were able to discern that the number of streetlights was a strong predictor of nighttime light output. And in Senegal, at least, satellite sensors could detect lights from a village with as few as 20 streetlights. Perhaps even more exciting for us was that we were able to demonstrate the ability to correctly classify whether a village was electrified or not, using primarily the satellite-based data. If the only information we had about a village was its location, its population, and how much light output is detected from that village point, we could use a statistical model to generate a predicted probability of whether that village is electrified or not. And so we did that for a randomly sorted, for our 1,000 villages randomly sorted, and you can kind of see the discernment that's happening in the predicted model there. And if we compare that to actual electrification status, the green dots are places that are actually electrified, the red dots are those that are not. There are some errors, but by and large, we do a pretty good job using just information, again, on the population and whether there's light output in the village or not, and classifying whether there is electricity in that village. Yeah, questions?
So for those villages that you have marked as unelectrified here,
Yes.
but have a high predicted probability of being electrified, would that be due to other light sources in the village, maybe fires, or some of the other factors that you mentioned, like population size or et cetera?
That's right. I mean, this is a very simple model. The only the two variables doing the work are population and light output. So either of those would be contributing to incorrect classification. Or a neighboring village, yeah. I mean, something else that happens sometimes, although not as much in Senegal, because villages tend to be not so, the population density, or the density of villages is pretty low. It is possible that light output from an electrified village is spilling over to an unelectrified village that contributes to the misclassification. But by and large, we were encouraged by the results. We replicated these surveys in Mali and in Vietnam and found additional evidence that generally supported the insight that satellite imagery does reveal information about electricity access and the intensity of its use, even in the world's least developing corners. So this is information that helps us to think about places like this. This is the village of Derhi in northern India. When the World Bank visited Derhi as part of its LSMS Living Standards surveys in 1998, Derhi was identified as one of the poorest villages in India, which makes it among the poorest villages in the world. Derhi had no electricity at the time, no school, no clinic, no pipe water, not even a road to connect it to the outside world. Now, when I visited Derhi in 2008, conditions had improved somewhat. As part of the Indian government's sweeping village electrification program, Derhi was electrified in July of 2007. And I could see clearly, as you can here in this picture, that infrastructure had been laid. Villagers told me that crews had appeared one day and spent the next few weeks installing some 60 poles, 3 kilometers of transmission cable, and 5 transformers, as well as connecting a handful of homes. But the day I was visiting, the power was not working. And in fact, villagers told me that the power has almost never worked since this work was complete. So Derhi is like so many places in the developing world where ambitious work has been done to extend the grid and connect the poor to electricity. So it's one thing to do the work, but the real hard question is this. Is the power working? Are people actually using electricity and benefiting from it? We can't answer this question based on individual visits like the one I did on that one day. We need new data, and what I'm going to show you right now is, for the first time, an ability to monitor what is happening in Derhi using new data collected by satellites. This is autonomously collected data that comes from the DMSP-OLS nighttime lights satellite data. Each point that you see here is the brightness of Derhi as observed on each night since 1993. The vertical line indicates the date of electrification, and as you can see in this data stream, the historical data record reveals that what I saw in 2008 was not very different from what has happened in Derhi in the years following. In fact, Derhi has not increased in brightness over the years.
Are the gaps there just data wasn't collected?
Yeah, I'll say more about that. There are particular gaps, and you see these seasonal gaps in data where there are data quality problems. There are actually a lot of data quality issues we have to work through. That's one of the big ones. But Derhi is just one village. What I'm going to show you today is a process that our team has been developing with the World Bank that has allowed us to create this data for every village in India, and show and demonstrate ways in which we can test propositions using this data. This is the data processing workflow that we've been using, and I'm not going to ask you to look at this in great detail, but what I will say is that we began by going back to NOAA, who has been archiving and housing all of the nighttime satellite imagery from DMSP since the early 1990s. And what we requested of them was access to the individual orbital image strips that were available, that have been archived. The images you saw before of Hardoi, those are annual composites, and they've been in the public domain for quite some time. We were asking for the nightly images, and initially, NOAA was somewhat reluctant, and actually urged us to exercise caution, because what they told us was that these individual suborbits, most of the images are really, really noisy. This is what they're talking about. Here's India, 30th of July of 2012. There's a lot of clouds that night. But that's on one night. If you look on another night, things look a little bit better. If the room was darker, it would look even better as well. The point is, we don't have 1, 2, or 3 nights of data. We've got thousands of nights of imagery collected over decades. And if we've got thousands of observations, then we have the ability to use tools, including statistical techniques, to help isolate and extract sources of noise to be able to focus on signal. So let me talk a little bit about how we engage in that process. We're going to zoom in on that area right there. This is in Uttar Pradesh, and there is our village of Derhi identified on that map. We were able to acquire the geographic coordinates of all villages in India, and for each of these villages, we basically looked at took the village coordinates, stacked all of our nightly images, and just ran through the image stack, recording the light output value recorded at that location. We write that to a file that ends up being actually a rather giant file. India has 600,000 villages. We have roughly 8,000 nights of data, and so we're talking about 5 billion or so observations that get written to a massive, massive data file. Importantly, we have some additional information about each village. We have the unique village identifier as recorded in the census, which then allows us to to link each of these records to census data on demographics and other information as well. Working with that large data set, we need to do some additional processing, and so we developed a variety of data querying processes using Hadoop that allowed us to extract out more useful data sets that were more readily available to work with. And so we produced a variety of sub-data sets that have then allowed us to engage in a variety of additional forms of analysis. There's one other important step that was referenced earlier in one of the questions, and that's what to do about, or why there are some gaps in the record. In fact, you might have seen in some of these images, some of those images are just cloudy. And so you wouldn't think you'd actually get any useful information about light output at the village level. We actually begin with this raw data stream that's plotted on the left. This is for Derhi again. If you actually plotted just the raw data record, you'd actually see there's massive amounts of noise in the data stream. And even though it's hard to see on this picture here, there are several months of every single year where the apparent brightness is at the maximum of 63, which is the maximum of this particular sensor. So there's months of the year when the brightness values are saturated at their maximal value, hinting again that there are problems in the data stream. That particular problem has to do with solar glare, something very specific to just the orientation of the satellite sensors during specific time periods of the year in which stray light from the sun just happens to bounce off and reflect and result in a bright band of light running through the image. We've got problems like that. We've got cloud cover issues. We've got other sources of digital noise that exist. In addition to all of those types of noise problems, we also have a problem in that the gain settings on the sensor vary dynamically every single night. By that I mean, think about a digital camera. If we're taking a picture in a darkened room, your camera is going to adjust the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO to try to maximize dynamic range. That's all happening on the satellite sensor as well, except that those records are not written into the data stream. And so we don't get to record, we don't even know what the sensors are at, what the values on those settings are. In addition, as Chris Elvidge, our collaborator at NOAA, who is the scientist responsible for this Nightlights archive, Chris Elvidge explained to me just some months ago, they also had the problem of Dennis. So Dennis sits in New Mexico somewhere. He works for the Air Force, and he watches the raw data stream coming in every single day. And every once in a while, he looks at the images and he says, you know, the quality seems to be degrading. It's harder to see these village lights. Let's turn up the gain setting a little bit. He manually adjusts the gain setting upwards. And he doesn't tell anyone. And then Chris calls some weeks later and says, you know, so the data look different. And Dennis says, yeah, I had to adjust the gain setting. Much of this is due to the fact that nobody in the Air Force cares at all about night lights. They don't care about the city lights that we're so interested in. They care about seeing clouds. It's a weather satellite, and they're trying to detect cloud cover. So the operational, I mean, we're kind of just snaking ourselves into a data process that was not meant for this purpose, and we're trying to retrieve valuable information. What I want to suggest as you look on the graph on the right is that there is a lot of progress that we can make. And so this version on the right is a statistically recalibrated set of values of the visible band brightness that incorporates several of the techniques of excluding the most noisy data periods, but also then trying to adjust and calibrate some of these factors that are happening in the background. One thing in particular that we do to account for this dynamic gain problem that I mentioned earlier is to use a technique that I guess astronomers use all the time in their image processing algorithms. You know that there are parts in your image that are dark, or that should be dark. And so you can use those background noise settings to try to estimate how much of the apparent brightness in your image is being produced by background noise, and then subtract out background noise from the overall image. In this setting, we do this by identifying locations across India that are unpopulated that are unelectrified, and according to our inference, there should be no ground-based source of lighting being generated from these points. And so we do this for a large number of control points across India that allow us to estimate some measure of background noise that's being generated, we assume, by gain settings on the sensor, subtract those out on each given day and produce this image, this set of data. This is Delhi. We don't see a lot of change in Delhi, but of course there are other places in India where actually the changes are rather dramatic. This is the village of Shorajpur in Allahabad district in UP, not too far away from Delhi. And here we see a village whose brightness is increasing quite dramatically in the last few years. So all of this then allows us for the first time to be able to monitor trends in light output at the village level for a large set of villages over time. What do we do with that? The current application that we're exploring is an evaluation of a large village electrification program that's being done in India. And this speaks to the kind of problem I spoke to earlier, in which the government of India has invested massive amounts of resources in electrifying, in this particular case, all remaining unelectrified villages in India. And yet there's great uncertainty as to whether that program has been effective or not. This program was launched in 2005. The commitment was to electrify over 100,000 villages. And to monitor those types of efforts, the traditional monitoring framework, even though you can't see this here, involves a traditional form of auditing that you might be familiar with, where you basically send people to randomly visit a very small sample of villages, perhaps 1% to see whether the work was done, whether the work was done well. The vast majority of places, we have nothing but the word of the people that claimed that the work was complete to go on. When Greenpeace India did an independent evaluation of RGTVY, they found a whole host of problems, including villages where the work was supposed to have been complete, and yet there was no evidence at all that the contractors had even arrived. And yet their sample was only 30 villages. And it's characteristic of the standard problem we have in most types of programs. We can use this technology then to evaluate systematically all of the villages and do that completely. Now, a simple way of answering the question is just to look at the data and say, are villages brighter after electrification? And so we have complete data for some 48,000 villages in this sample. And so for these 48,000 villages, we can just sort the data into observations before the claimed electrification of the village and after the claimed electrification and evaluate the brightness. When we do that comparison, the simple t-test statistic there tells us there's a difference. Villages are brighter after electrification, and it is statistically significant. And yet, there's a lot of reasons to be wary of a simple comparison of data of this sort, because there's lots of things that are changing across India over this time period. And so we are not controlling for secular trends or for other trends in the data that might be accounting for some of this effect. So we use interrupted time series analysis to try to isolate more cleanly the effect of electrification. Over the last 2 decades, India has been growing at actually unprecedented rates of economic growth, and so we know there's been a wide array of development happening all across India. We want to control for any overall trends that are existing all across the country in terms of overall increases in brightness, and focus our attention around the date of electrification. And so in this sample image, on this date of electrification, is there a disjuncture in the data series? Is there a change in the trend? And so we have 2 quantities of interest that we can focus on here. Beta 2 helps us identify the disjuncture. Is there some discontinuity in the time series that's happening at the date of electrification? And beta 3, which allows us to estimate whether there's a change in the trend over time. We run these regression models then for every single village in our sample, and so the quantities of interest we can then array geographically on a map to get a sense of what is actually happening. This is beta 2, the impact of electrification. So that short-run impact, the short-run change in brightness are just after the electrification date. And the green dots are places where our models tell us there's a positive change in brightness. Yellow dots are places where there's nothing significant. Red dots are problematic areas where, in fact, actually, it looks like the impact was negative. We can do this for beta 3 as well, which was the post-electrification trend, and plot those more broadly for other regions, for all of the regions of the country. All of this then suggests one approach, or suggests an approach, in which we can use autonomously collected data to track changes that are happening in villages on a quantity that actually matters, on whether villages are bright at night or not. Now there are some critical assumptions underlying this entire approach, some of which I've mentioned, some of which I haven't, that may be lingering in your head. All we see is whether there's light being produced at night from these communities. And so if there is use of electricity indoors, we don't see it. However, we do know that in rural communities, especially in the developing world, illumination is usually the #1 benefit of electricity that people answer in surveys. Outdoor illumination then is a natural outgrowth, and we have seen this in many of the communities we've visited. Being able to have some lighting outdoors is a huge benefit to individuals and to communities. That's what we're seeing. We're also seeing the availability of electrical power in the hours in which the satellite is flying overhead. The specific time of overpass does vary, but typically it's between 7:30 and 10 p.m. local time. And so these are peak hours of household demand for electricity. And so we're actually capturing something that really matters. We can do this systematically and do this autonomously. All of this data that we've generated then, our goal is not just to hold it up here and be able to do some interesting statistical analysis, but also to enable citizens, especially in India, to investigate patterns happening in their own individual communities. And so we've spent a lot of effort developing a web platform that enables access to much of the underlying data that I've shared with you today, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Anand Thakur, who will share and introduce the data at the website.
Brian, while he's setting up, I have a quick question. Do you have a hypothesis for why, for I think it was 15% of these villages, electrification had a negative impact?
Yeah, so this is that was initially kind of a stunning thing to see. There's a couple things I think that are going on. One is that this program has invested incredible resources in extending the grid, extending wires into thousands and thousands of new villages. But in many states, including in UP, there has been no increase in the overall power supply. And so the addition of millions of customers has actually resulted in increased load shedding in many rural areas. I think some of that is happening there. Some of the other things, another thing that might be happening is more statistical in nature, which is that you saw that these were plotting two linear trends. It may be the effort to best fit that post-electrification trend line leads to a slightly negative gap. And so there are a couple different things that are going on. Some of it on the ground, some of it having to do with this.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Anand Thakur. I work at Development Seed. We're an open source, open data shop, tech shop that work on a number of humanitarian or development problems. And we worked with the bank and with Brian's team to build this website. So as Brian said, the data set that he produced, even after extracting the particular values for the villages, well, for all of the villages, from those images was quite massive. So it was 600,000 villages. It was every night for 20 years. It added up to, I think, about like 1.2 terabytes or so. And so that's a little bit much to digest. And it's also just one big data file, and so it's not so accessible to non-data nerds, right? So our kind of goal was to make it more accessible, and we did that, I guess, actually first in the form of an API. So we took the 1.2 terabytes of nightly data and digested it down to monthly medians, and then built an open API, which I'll show you the link to. An open API whereby you can query the light curves, the monthly light data for the whole 20 years, for any village or for any district or for any state. And then as sort of like a way to expose this data to someone who isn't going to directly work with the numbers, but also sort of as the first, just simply as the first example of how the API can be used, we built this site here. And so this is sort of a data explorer that lets you kind of just move through the data set both in space and time. So here you've got a picture of just a visualization of the light values of all the, I guess at this level it's a sample of all the villages. And you can kind of move through time, and actually if you pick the right dates, you can even find, you can sometimes find those dates that Brian mentioned where there are data quality.
Typically sometimes. There.
Oh yeah, yeah. So you can see the summertime where there are lots of clouds or where there's a lot of solar flare. Anyhow, so then you can navigate through time. You can see the curves of the sort of state aggregate light values for the different states, but maybe more interestingly, sort of look at down at the state level, or even more. Where's Ardoy? Even more interestingly, down at the district level, and this is great because once we're down to the district level, we can actually kind of afford to transfer over the network the data for every single village. So this is actually these are the data here for the October of 2008 of every village in Ardoy. Yep. So actually, I don't know if it shows up super clearly here, but sorry. If you yeah, maybe not. I was hoping that we might be able to see your politician's influence right here on these charts, but I think you have to dig in a little bit further. Okay, so that's just the overview there. Just another quick example down at the village level. This is a district that I think the group here has been working with a lot, the Vaishali district. So I just thought that'd be a good example to look at it with. And here you can see a few individual villages selected. You can just sort of click and get the curves added onto the graph here for all of those. And so here on the graph below, the yellow line is the district median, and then the sort of lighter, can you see the lighter band around it? Yeah, the lighter band around it is the 20th to 80th percentile of the whole district. And that's just for reference, so that then when you're looking at these red lines for individual villages, you kind of see how they compare to the rest of the district. And it's interesting, you've got pretty steady levels here, and then a lot of activity happening in the last few years. And in particular, you've got, let's see, these 3 villages around here where there's this big jump, and then it goes down a little, but it's still, like, overall it's gone quite a bit up. And then sort of compellingly complementary to that, there are these couple of villages not too far away where the opposite is happening. And I don't have any idea what that means, but it is interesting that it's happening, and you can sort of find things like this by digging around in the data. So that's sort of the purpose of this tool. And then, as I said, behind it is an API that's just a simple like REST API whereby you can query individual districts and villages and states, and that's where all of this data is getting powered from. It's all open source, it's all on GitHub, and yeah. feel free to dig in and use it. I think that's it for me, and then I guess we have some time for questions.
Sure. Bruno, do you have anything to add? And
No, I
for the
wanted
ride?
to say that there are 4 speakers in 1 hour, is a lot of speakers too, so I'm happy to jump into the questions.
Okay.
Just to say that our role, or the part of the World Bank that I represent, is called the Innovation Labs, which basically tries to identify really cool projects that are very data-driven and tries to accelerate the use. So for example, in this case, Kwawu practice on energy was doing this project was very interesting for us because I think it reflects a lot of data-driven development that I would like to see more and more happening, and on the work that Brian was doing, and how we could, by putting in place some other players, like for example development seed, how could we leverage that data to be scaled up or accelerated so that other people are using that, and now we're thinking about doing this maybe in Africa and other places, and also at the same time trying to find demand on that. Okay, is this useful to you? If so, use it. Is this not useful to you, but it could be because this is missing or that part is missing? Tell us. Because we're investing a lot of time. We can see a lot of things we could build on top of this, but instead of keep building on something, scope creeping in, because there's so many things we could do that, we like to talk with you, MIT, to say, hey, is this useful for you? How? We want to talk with India. By the way, you're getting the sneak peek because we are launching this in India in 2 weeks. We have an event there, so you are get the privileged access to that. It's all available at nightlights.io. If you like the idea, do it. Actually, I'm just gonna say the pitch. If you wanna work for the World Bank doing this kind of innovative stuff, just ping me because we're also looking always for right people to work on these data issues. But please, let's start with the discussions. If you think it's useful, if you want what kind of projects you would like to see more, if you have technical questions, feel free to reach to us now or later.
Sure. Great. So we have plenty of time. If anyone has questions, feel free. You can get the light.
Is there a data set with survey results? I'm not sure if it was a survey or not, but survey results maybe from the government on whether or not a village was electrified, and then comparing that with
Yeah, so I didn't have to go into enough detail. That's what we had. And actually that, the government of India is amazingly efficient from a bureaucratic standpoint. There are thousands and thousands of records associated with that RGGBY program that records a whole host of information about exactly what was done in these villages. The piece that we were leveraging or paying most attention to was the electrification date. There is a date at which that village is successfully declared electrified, and according to government records, then the work is complete. Now, some of you know that India in particular, but well, not only India, but every country needs to come up with some specific definition of electrification. In India, that definition established in 2005 in conjunction with that program required that there be a power line coming into the village, that at least 10% of households had a connection to the grid, and that at least one or some public facilities were electrified. RGGBY is a program that's been trying to target that, and progress is only increasing, because once those targets are met, once you reach that, then the village gets checked out. So progress is increasing. Anyone on the ground will tell you. On the other hand, problems with electricity supply are getting worse. And so there's this huge gap between what the government's records record in terms of the thousands and thousands of villages that are electrified in each year, and what's actually happening on the ground. Is there electricity that's being productively used? And that was the objective of doing this comparison. Yeah, in the back.
What's the satellite image resolution, and is that like a limiting factor?
Yeah, it is a limiting factor. So DMS-POLS on board, they claim. So there's actually a little bit of uncertainty here, but the number that NOAA says is 2.7 kilometers is the spatial resolution, which is roughly good enough to be able to identify whether a village has electricity. Clearly, it doesn't help you to get much lower than that. I do want to mention also that, yeah, so okay, so those blocks you see are kind of the blocks the spatial resolution, the blocky spatial resolution of PQC of the nightlights. And so there are some villages that are closer than 2.7 kilometers to one another, and so those are going to be, there's obvious spatial correlation there. But generally speaking, you can do that. Below that, you can't do much. I wanted to mention there is a newer satellite series that some of you might be aware of. VIIRS has been in orbit since 2012 or so, producing nighttime light output data. It is the successor to DMSP. It collects data at something closer to 750 meters resolution. The primary limitation for our purposes, or for purposes of energy access, is that the overpass time is closer to 2 to 3 a.m. And so it's middle of the night brightness, which is unfortunate because it doesn't capture the peak hours of electricity use that DMSP has. Yes.
It sounds like there's a lot of surprising results with the effectiveness of the electrification program. Has there been like an impact in how this program has been perceived in India, and will they be a potential end user with this? People are managing?
Yeah, well that's a big question. I'm kind of curious as to what Kwawu thinks about this. In a sense, many of our results, the fact that we were not finding overwhelmingly positive evidence of a large impact around electrification, that result is not a surprise to anyone, because that's what people have been saying on the ground, that there seem to be a lot of problems. I think, though, what our tool allows us to do is not just to validate preconceived conceptions, but actually to say there's spatial variation. It's not that it's not working everywhere. In fact, there are some areas where the impact seems to be quite positive. In some of my other work, I've done some political analysis of this, and it seems that the electoral security of incumbents is highly correlated with effectiveness. In other words, places where incumbents have won by huge win margins and don't really need to worry about re-election because they're winning by such huge margins, they don't seem to worry or care very much if projects like this are not being effectively implemented. But in places where politicians win by very small win margins and are facing more competitive environments, here's an opportunity to deliver services to your constituents, and in these areas we see more positive impact. So there's spatial variation. That's the first key point. The second key point is that resources to conduct audits are always limited, and to conduct the more focused investigations. But rather than doing the kind of 1% random samples that is typical, here's a technology that allows you to pinpoint your auditing resources to investigate areas, districts, communities where there seem to be problems that are red, to kind of investigate what is going on, what's happening in these areas.
What I can say is that this monitoring of rural electrification program is actually something that happens across the world. India is not a case, an isolated case. You have that all the time. But what is interesting with this work is by showing these images, people start asking questions about what exactly is happening on the ground and what was the performance of those entities that went to deliver the work. So if, for instance, you receive a report that this area has been electrified, and with the images, you get a sense that things are not going well, you can actually go and trace back and double check what has actually been done. And the other things that we are thinking about is the government of India has spent billions, okay, on this program, but the amount that they have spent on monitoring is not as high. By having this tool, it provides them another opportunity to really see whether there is effectiveness in the program, which is one aspect, and also sustainability, because you are adding a lot of people to the grid. You have to make sure that they get electricity, and if they don't get it, then you see the type of images that you have seen.
Yes, and I'll add to that, maybe not in this case so much because of the situation of India and life, but one of the things that Trend Innovation Labs are pushing a lot is one of the types of loans the bank does, which is called Program for Results. But basically, we don't give the money at once. We give the money according to a metric of success, or metric of monitoring. We are doing that in China with improving road networks. So basically, we say, okay, what percentage of the population have access to hospitals within 1 hour? What happens if you increase this or that road? That increases that. Then you get the loan to improve this thing because you have driven your development to data. So something I'd love to see, maybe not in India because it would be very political, but other places, to say, look, we have the electrification program, this is what we see from space, these are the villages we want to see the impact, this is the impact we expect, this is the metric of our program for result loan or grant to implement changes.
Yeah.
The other kind of use or application is like now in India you have like a huge, at least promise of commitment for developing microgrids and the rollout of solar panels across the country. So in that situation where you don't have like a central data set of knowing like a grid level, knowing that these places have been electrified, you can use this imagery to see the results from those kind of programs at the microgrid level.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that proposes a whole new set of challenges as you have actors, NGOs operating in the energy space that aren't necessarily operating in a coordinated manner, aren't necessarily reporting data in a centralized manner. How much progress is happening there? That's right. Now, there's potentially some limitations there as I think about it. I mean, I think actually one thing that is a result of India's heavy subsidies for electricity to residential users, especially in rural areas, is that most users, once you have electricity, you're happy to use as much as possible, because you're paying a flat rate or you're paying a very, very low rate for its use. And so adding light bulbs, for example, is a pretty negligible cost. It doesn't add incrementally to what you're paying each month. I wonder whether with microgrids, when you're now worried about exactly how much battery power you have to use in a given day, perhaps maybe you're not wasting that much electricity shining it out onto your front yard. So perhaps there are some issues like that to think about, but I like the idea. Yeah.
Has there been or are there plans for this to be used to inform where the on-the-ground auditing does take place? For instance, as you mentioned, you can say, oh, this place has nominally been electrified, but it looks like from our satellite images that nothing has changed. Maybe we should go check that out rather than randomly choosing something.
I think this is why we are actually going to India in 2 weeks, because this work has been developed with the government data, but we haven't had a lot of interaction with them. Now we want to present the result and then tell them that, or suggest to them that there are several opportunities in which they can use the data, and one of them is definitely this one. And one thing that I can say is that because of the way you can get an overview of the entire program at once, definitely creates strong opportunities for this type of approaches.
But it's not only for government, also, we also did talk about this, and we had a session in Davos in the World Economic Forum meeting there where a lot of the private sector meets. And the idea is that that data is not only useful for citizens, journalists, governments, or in multilateral agencies, but also the private sector. And that's totally fine. We want them to use this. For example, if you're a company that provides renewable energy, and this is a real case, and you want to identify places where you could invest more resources to build those windmills, to put those solar panels, this tool allows you to really see what happens or how to optimize where to place the investments. And this is something that is happening. We also need in India with them, because this is not only good for monitoring, this is not only good for academic reasons, this is not only good for governments. Those things are checked, they're already being done, or even on the books to do that. We're also keen to see what other people can use this.
Yeah. If I want to replicate this study for another country, what should I do? Is it relatively easy, long?
I think the plan has been to do that for the entire world. And we spend a lot of time trying to have a systematic approach. And we have reached a point where if someone wants to replicate that for another country, it's very easy. You just need to have the data, because the process is all well defined, and the API is also accessible, open source, and so on. So that is the goal that you are actually pursuing. So apart from India, there are plans to use this in South Sudan, there are plans to use that in Africa. So we are now working on those various initiatives.
Is there a region of the world you're thinking of?
Many. Africa and Middle East.
Oh, great. Okay, I think we can discuss offline.
That would be great. Thanks.
bottlenecks are going to be, one, the raw data from NOAA. It takes some time to get that because it's physically in disks. They need to physically take those tapes, read those tapes. That's step one. When you have those TIFF files, you need to ask the questions of how lights in those villages. So you need to know where the villages are. If you're lucky, your place is well mapped in OSM, for example, OpenStreetMap, you're set. If not, you need to get the data from those places. In the case of India, there was another bottleneck because it's very hard to find the location of all those villages. Once you do that, then you need to do the step, which is probably the most time-consuming, at least the one Brian's team did, is to do all those corrections for moonlight, for monsoon, for places that you know there are that step is gonna be hard. And then once you do that, the rest is basically all done because the website, both the API and the front facing, is completely open source by design. So that's basically, and that's our aim. Our aim is to do ideally the whole world. But let's see what we can get. The more demand we find, the better. So it's good to know that you want to use them.
Any final questions? I don't know if you guys have a few minutes afterwards. You can feel free to come up and ask them questions individually. Otherwise, thank you very much. Really appreciated you coming. And next week, 5:30, not 6, 5:30.
Thank you.